My jaw is still on the floor because you're now talking about people who are no longer living, who are somehow transmitting information or having their entire consciousness placed in another body.
We've studied over 2,000 cases of young children who say they remember a past life. If you look at the cases, there is a consciousness realm that interacts with the physical reality, but is also apart from it. There are times when the consciousness comes back to this same reality in a young child.
I can't. I'm free. I got chills up the back of my neck already.
If you get data that conflicts with what you think you know of how the world works, well, then you have to question what you think. I have become quite convinced that there's more than just the physical world, that there is this element or realm of consciousness, first of all, and that we all have a piece of it.
This is an enormous statement. So the notion is... As you may have heard a few weeks back, we won 2 Webby Awards and a Gracie Award, and we wanted to say thank you. We could not be prouder. Thank you to everyone in our community who's been with us along the way and has supported our podcast. And before we start today's episode, we want to share some very big news. We are expanding the Mayim Bialik's Breakdown universe on Substack. That's right. Next week, we are launching a special new community for the Mayim Bialik's Breakdown community so that we can connect in deeper and more meaningful ways. If you go over to Substack and you subscribe, you will get weekly lives where Jonathan and I reflect on the episodes and we offer new insights. You will also get access to my personal writing. So we strongly suggest subscribe and follow us over there. I already have some posts in the works about my time on The Big Bang Theory, my time throughout my acting career, as well as discussing some of the most frequently hot topics that we cover in mental health, well-being, and spirituality here on MBB. We're also going to be from Substack, reviewing episodes, talking about current events, and answering individual questions. If you choose to become a paid supporter, which I hope that you will, you'll also get additional Monday check-ins, a ton of bonus podcast content that's never been seen before, personal messages from me and Jonathan, access to the community chat, also special episodes with amazing expert guests that you cannot see anywhere else, and a lot of other totally awesome features. It's all going to be on our Substack. We're on a journey here to figure out who we are, what we can do to feel better, to live better, and we all know that opening our minds and hearts can help us achieve things that we never believed possible. That's what our podcast has been seeking to do for almost 300 episodes, and that's what we're continuing to do, and we're going to do it as we expand on Substack. So please head over to our Substack right now, Mayim Bialik's Breakdown. Check out the different tiers that we have available. There's also a free plan that includes access to the MBB newsletter, which will live exclusively on Substack, bonus clips from select episodes, Monday teases of the week's episode. So no matter what you choose, you will get awesome things that you can only get on Substack. We're very proud of what we're creating here. We could not have done it without all of you. Please come join us, be a part of the MBB community on Substack as we all thrive and seek to be healthier, happier, and more inspired. Thank you from me, from Jonathan, and from our entire team at Mayim Bialik's Breakdown. We will see you on Substack. And now on to the episode. Hi, I'm Mayim Bialik.
I'm Jonathan Cohen.
And welcome to our breakdown. We've talked about a lot of these paradigm shifting concepts that we're going to discuss today, but we have never discussed them with someone who is a psychiatrist, the head of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. He has spent his entire career as a clinical psychiatrist examining the possibility that when we die, our consciousness lives on. That's right, folks. We are talking today about a practical understanding of life after death. This is not floofy-woofy. This is not, I had a dream. This is, what does it look like to do a systematic analysis of reports that are outside of our understanding of the experience of dying? We're going to be speaking to Dr. Jim Tucker. He is a child psychiatrist. And for the past 25 years, he has dedicated his career both to a clinical practice, and he was the Bonner Lowry Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. He's the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies. It's an extensive, legitimate research group that explores the mind's relationship to the body and specifically the possibility that consciousness somehow survives after death. This is one of the most respected people in this field, and we get to ask him all of the questions that I'm sure you're dying to know. He's going to talk about specific examples. He's going to talk about some examples from his books, Life Before Life and Return to Life. He's going to explain to us in the most plain terms what evidence can provide for us in terms of our understanding of what could fundamentally be the breaking down of our understanding of the material world and what happens when we die.
Beautifully explained. He describes an example, many examples that he's studied where children remember past lives and claim to be people from the past with significant evidence that he says cannot be explained.
And one of the most fascinating things about what him and his team do and have done for the past 25 years is they have examined over 2,000 of these cases to try and figure out what is possible that would explain this away and what is statistically significantly impossible to explain many aspects of these experiences. So he is the first one to say, not every experience can be explained this way. Not every piece of evidence lines up, but for the ones that do, it is undeniable that something is going on here that is beyond our current understanding. And he's going to break down the science around that. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Jim B. Tucker to the Breakdown. Break it down. Dr. Tucker, welcome to the Breakdown.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
So you come to us by way of Scott Barry Kaufman, who we had on our podcast, and then I sort of started doing a deep dive into all the people that he has had on his podcast, and you were one of the people that he sat in conversation with, and I said to Jonathan, we have to talk to Jim Tucker. So thank you for being here. A little bit about sort of what Jonathan and I do here is we talk a lot about the intersection of science and spirituality. And we are very interested in phenomenal things, but we're also interested in the practical understanding of phenomenal things. You study something that is absolutely impossible for us to wrap our minds around with any linear materialistic view of the world. Can you explain to people what you have dedicated your academic and clinical career to?
Right. So, as far as clinical career, I just did routine child psychiatry for decades. But on the research side, the academic side, I trained at UVA, but then I was in private practice. But I came back to UVA to continue the work by Ian Stevenson, who was originally the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and then had established this research division. And his particular interest was young children from all over the world who report that they remember a past life.
You've already lost a lot of people just by saying that. So talk a little bit more about what Dr. Stevenson did and what you've continued.
Yeah, so this is what we think is a serious-minded look at this phenomenon to see, okay, what is happening here, and is there evidence of survival after death? Is there evidence that these kids are actually remembering a past life? And again, it's not from a religious bent or anything like that. It's more of being as sort of objective as we can about it. So we've studied over 2,000 cases, and you can find them essentially wherever you look, of young children who say they remember a past life. The question that we have is, are the details that they're giving, do they actually match somebody who did live in the past? And there are a number of cases where we can't determine that. So it really does not provide any evidence of continuation. But then there are the ones where we can.
So, I mean, my jaw, like I know what you do. I've read about you. I've listened to your, other interviews you've done. My jaw is still on the floor because this is something that, purports to sort of bend our very basic concept that when we die, we die. And even if you are willing to entertain something like the spirit goes on, people remember you, maybe you even have a religious concept, of some sort of existence, you're now talking about people who are no longer living, who are somehow transmitting information or having not just their identity, but kind of their entire consciousness placed in another body that then has consciousness enough to present that to a psychiatrist.
That sounds odd to you? So, right. Now, I will say it doesn't come across to the kids as transmitting information, that a deceased person is transmitting information to them. I mean, from their experiences, very much things that actually they did, things that happened to them when they were living before. Yeah, I mean, if you're purely taking a materialist view of reality, then these cases make no sense. So then you're kind of stuck dealing with, okay, well, what do I do with this evidence? And what many people do is simply dismiss it. But that's not what we have chosen to do. And frankly, that doesn't seem very scientific, right? I mean, if you get data that conflicts with what you think you know of how the world works, well, then you have to question what you think and whether you need to make adjustments.
Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by Bzigo.
I love all creatures, but I really, really dislike mosquito bites. I'm actually very allergic to mosquitoes. And I'm one of those people, they know that I am allergic and they come for me. Mosquitoes are not just a nuisance. Their bites can actually lead to health concerns. As temperatures rise and urban areas expand, mosquito populations grow, increasing the risk that mosquitoes can pose to our health. And that is where Bzigo Iris comes in. It's the world's first AI-powered mosquito detector. Bzigo Iris is a cutting-edge device that uses computer vision and AI to detect, track, and pinpoint mosquitoes in real time. No more guessing, no more swatting at thin air, no more wearing a full snowsuit in the middle of summer so that you don't get bit. Just a simple, precise way to finally take control of your space. Bzigo's advanced computer vision system scans your space 24/7, detecting mosquitoes instantly. Once a mosquito lands, Bzigo uses an eye-safe laser to pinpoint its exact location. It's really unbelievable. You can get real-time notifications via the Bzigo app, so you can act fast whether you're in the room or not. Bzigo's night vision detection works in total darkness using infrared technology. It's chemical-free, eco-friendly, no need for toxic sprays or plugins, just smart technology protecting your home. Bzigo's travel mode makes it an ideal companion for mosquito-infested destinations, and you can pair it with the Bzigo swatter. Once Bzigo marks the mosquito, use the swatter for easy elimination. Stop losing sleep over mosquitoes. Take back your nights with Bzigo. Go to bzigo.com/discount/break and save 10% off.
That's bzigo.com/discount/break and use code BREAK to get 10% off. Say goodbye to itchy bites and sleepless nights. Thank you, Bzigo, for sponsoring this episode. Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by BetterHelp.
Most of us are aware by now that it is of utmost importance to maintain mental health. Societal views on therapy have evolved dramatically throughout the years. Even in the 4.5 years since Jonathan and I started this podcast, we've seen a huge reduction in the stigma around talking about mental health struggles, and we're very grateful for that. For Mental Health Awareness Month, BetterHelp has surveyed 16,000 people across 23 countries for its first ever State of Stigma report. They found that while 75% of people believe that it is so smart to get support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy. And when people hesitate to get help, it doesn't just affect them, it impacts families, workplaces, and entire communities. Let's encourage everyone to take care of their well-being and break the stigma. The world is better when people are healthy and when they can understand their own happiness and seek happiness. So many times people feel like, I can do it on my own, it's not that bad, I don't need help. A lot of people don't realize you can give therapy a try, see how it works for a few sessions, see if it's a good match. It can change your life and your perspective. We're all better with help. 72% of BetterHelp members reported a reduction in symptoms. Visit betterhelp.com/break to get 10% off your first month of therapy.
That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/break. Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by AG1.
We've got some huge news to share with you all. AG1 just launched their next generation. Same single scoop once a day, but now with more vitamins, minerals, and upgraded probiotics. And it's clinically backed by 4 human clinical trials. They have seriously gone the distance to raise the standard in supplement testing. AG1's next gen is now one of the most clinically backed greens powders. They went above and beyond the industry standard in testing and have made a great product even better. Most supplements aren't clinically studied, but AG1 Next Gen is different. Backed by 4 human clinical trials, AG1 Next Gen reflects their ongoing commitment to research. In a clinical trial, it was shown to increase healthy gut bacteria, something we talk about a lot here, by 10 times. It's also clinically shown to help fill common nutrient gaps, even in healthy eaters. People who think, like, I'm eating great. There are still nutrient gaps. With optimized absorption and impact, added vitamins and minerals, and an upgraded probiotic blend, the new formula is more comprehensive than ever, helping to support immune health, gut health, energy, and more. AG1 supports our energy needs, our skin health from within, digestive regularity, cravings, immune support, even a healthy mood. It's very important and easy to start your day with 1 scoop of AG1. Now clinically backed with an advanced formula, this is the perfect time to try AG1 if you haven't yet. We've been drinking AG1 for about 4 years now, and we're very happy to be partnering with them. Subscribe today to try the next gen of AG1. Use our link, get a free bottle of AG D3K2, an AG1 welcome kit, and 5 of the upgraded AG1 travel packs with your first order. Make sure to check out drinkag1.com/breakdown to get started with AG1's next gen and notice the benefits for yourself.
That's drinkag1.com/breakdown. Jim, where did you start on the spectrum of materialist to non-materialist when you got into this work?
I would say my spiritual sense was sort of quiescent as an adult. I had gone to church, so forth, growing up. As an adult, I would say, open-minded, really. So I didn't reject the idea of consciousness or spirituality, but at the same time, it was just sort of in the background. And then when my wife and I got together, she was much more open to such things and opened me up in many, many ways, but including really examining, is there more to reality than just what we see here in our day-to-day lives? And in particular, this question of consciousness and surviving after death. So when we saw that Ian Stevenson's research group was starting a new study actually on near-death experiences, at my wife's suggestion, I called them up to see if they needed help interviewing patients. Again, not because I was convinced one way or the other, but because I wanted to sort out for myself, is something going on here? And so I did a little work on near-death experiences, but then as Ian Stevenson entered his 80s and did not have anyone to carry on the work at the university, that was sort of a slot for me. So then initially I was just volunteering an hour or two, but eventually I shut down my private practice or left my private practice and joined the UVA faculty, again, being a child psychiatrist, but also continuing to explore, again, for myself, is there something here? So I can't claim that I necessarily had great motivations to help the world, but more of sorting out for myself whether there is good reason to think that we may continue on after death. And if people, when people have heard the work, then sometimes hopefully I think it does help them. But it's also continues to be an intellectual exercise for me of trying to sort this out.
Because I like movies and I used to write them, I like to go into like the moment where the character sort of has this realization. Was there a moment where you were like living your life and kind of curious, but not overly religious or spiritual, and this idea introduced itself to you? Like, was there that moment where there was sort of a push or pull, which you then obviously pursued and became more curious about?
No, I mean, I think it was more of a gradual process, again, with my wife. Now, as far as a single moment that convinced me, okay, this is worth something. That something is going on here. There's a well-known American case, James Leininger, who is thought to be a World War II pilot, returned. And with that one, Yeah, we hear about a lot of cases, and sometimes they sound really intriguing, but then when you get into the details, you see kind of the weaknesses of the case or things that don't quite fit. The more I explored that one, actually, the stronger it got because I realized we had a lot of documentation of what he had said before anyone had any idea if there was such a pilot that he was describing. And
Can you describe the case for people who may not be familiar?
yeah, of course. So James Langer is a little boy who was the son of a Christian couple in Louisiana who, when he was around the time of his second birthday, started having horrific nightmares multiple times a week in which he would be kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And then during the day, he would take his little toy airplanes and repeatedly say, "Airplane crash on fire," and bam, slam them into the family's coffee table. And I have a picture of it. There are dozens of scratches and dents from airplane crash on fire. He looked like a traumatized kid.
Well, hold on one second though. But and I want you to sort of talk us through this. Many kids have nightmares. Many kids will then recreate their nightmares in their play as a sort of way to try and figure it out. Many kids say I mean, my kids barely spoke it too, so the whole thing is shocking that a 2-year-old is having such, But what happens next when this child presents with this?
Well, right. If it's just that, then we don't make anything of it. What happened next was that his parents were able to talk to him about this material several times while he was awake. And what he said was that the Japanese had shot down his plane, that his plane was a Corsair, which I'd never heard of, but it's a type of plane developed during World War II, and that he flew off of a boat. And his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma, which seems like kind of a strange name for a U.S. aircraft carrier. But after that conversation, his father did an online search, and this was back in 2000, so it took him a while to find anything, but he eventually found information about the USS Natoma Bay, which in fact was stationed in the Pacific during World War II.
Wow.
They would also ask him who he was, and he would just say me or James. And then one time they asked him who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. So this was all when he was 2, and then when he was 2.5, his father had gotten a book on Iwo Jima to give to his own father, James's grandfather. And James came and got in his lap as he was looking through it one day, and they came to a picture, an aerial view of Iwo Jima, and James pointed at it and said, "That's where my airplane got shot down."
I can't. I got chills up the back of my neck already.
Well, so did his father. That his 2.5-year-old was saying, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." So then it turned out that, in fact, the USS Natoma Bay did take part in the Iwo Jima operation. So eventually, with all this going on, his parents began to wonder, is this kid remembering a past life? Even though his father in particular was really opposed to the idea of past lives and reincarnation, but before James started saying these things, in fact, he started looking into it to prove to his wife that there's nothing to it. But eventually became persuaded that there was. So when James was 4, his dad went to a Natoma Bay reunion, and he learned a couple of things. One, that there was, in fact, Jack Larson who had been on the ship. So he went in, he had been looking for Jack Larsons among the war dead, but this Jack Larson had survived the war and was actually still alive. So he went and met him and learned that, in fact, he was on the ship during the time of the Iwo Jima operation. Because, of course, with these ships, there are groups rotating on and off. And then he had also learned that there was one and only one pilot from the Natoma Bay who was killed during the Iwo Jima operation. This was a young man from Philadelphia named James Houston, which meant if James Leininger was recalling a past life, it had to be Houston's life. And what we see, one thing is James would always sign his pictures of planes and battle scenes, which he drew scores of, as James 3, and said, "I'm the third James." Well, James Houston was James Jr., which would make James Leininger the third James. James said how he had been shot down by the Japanese, which Houston was. He said that he was flying a Corsair. Houston was actually flying a different plane when he was killed, but he was part of the squadron that tested the Corsair for the Navy. James said that his plane got hit in the engine and then crashed in the water. And eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was hit dead on right in the motor. James had nightmares of where he crashed in the water and quickly sank, which is what Houston's plane did. James had said how Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was the name of the pilot next to Houston on the day that he was killed. Not only is that a lot of details that have been verified, but they're very specific details, actual names. And all the things that I just told you are ones that we have records of that were made before Houston was identified, before anyone around James Leininger knew if there even was such a pilot. And this sort of aha moment for me, which I should have figured out earlier, was that ABC News made this special about extraordinary events that actually never aired, but it included a segment on past life memories and had an interview with James's parents. This was before Houston was identified. And they also interviewed me for it, so they sent me a copy even though it never aired. So it eventually dawned on me, that's evidence of what James had said before Houston was identified, and it includes things like his mom saying that one day James said, "Mama, my plane was shot in the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." And there was also talk of Iwo Jima and other things. So when I saw that all that was documented, I still have not heard a decent explanation that explains away this case. There was a critic, a skeptic, who wrote a 90-some page article about it, where he'd done a lot of work on it, but his piece didn't amount to anything. He still couldn't challenge the basics of this case, which is that James Leininger, with no way of knowing about this one pilot of thousands or hundreds of thousands that were killed in the war, no way that he could have known the details about this guy, and yet everything that we have documented that James said, all those things were accurate for James Hughes.
All right, so I have a couple things that I want to sort of address. So, and I did not bring you here to prove that you're wrong. I don't want you to feel like I'm attacking you from that perspective. No. But that's not. There's a couple things that one has to set aside if you're going to have a reasonable kind of thought experiment about this. The first is that some people would say, like, everyone's lying, meaning all the eyewitnesses who confirmed it, it was misremembered, it was inappropriately cataloged, So, and I'm sure there are statistical analyses you can do for the number of things that would have to be misreported in order to have, a series of details be not considered significant. But some people might say that. Some people might say, just because the eyewitness said that the plane was hit in the engine or the motor doesn't mean that it was. And this is where Jonathan and I kind of come up against some of the challenges that I and many have with the telepathy tapes. If you have someone say that something happened, that doesn't mean that it happened. It means that someone said that it happened. But your job in this kind of analysis is to try and understand it from all these different perspectives. So I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to set aside people who are just like, all the eyewitnesses are lying and it's just a bunch of hooey, blah, blah. So let's just set that aside.
Well, can I address that first?
If you'd like. I mean, yeah, I don't give that, personally, I don't give that line of thinking much credence because I find it very unscientific, meaning if you're presented with a certain amount of information that seems to be statistically significant, it is your responsibility to investigate it and not simply discard it. But I'm happy for you to speak to that as well if you'd like to.
Right. So that's why documentation becomes so important. So, and this was James's dad that did the vast bulk of this work. There are military records that document Houston's crash. And yes, there is the one thing with the eyewitnesses, but most of it is, well, I mean, they were eyewitnesses back in 1942 or whenever it was, but, you know, it's not people making up stuff now to fit with what they find out happened to the pilot. It's stuff that was documented decades ago. And we've also got documentation of James's father searching for things and like searching for Jack Larson and you know, I mean, writing people trying to find out about this guy. So the paper trail for this one is quite impressive.
The next thing that I'd like to also set aside is the notion that, and again, I don't believe this, but his parents could be making all of this up. And I'm sure you've had to deal with this literally for decades. What if either the child had, I'm just going to make this up, the child had access to things that his father found interesting, and his father, in reality, loved to research things about World War II and had told this story. It somehow got into the child's head, and the child has an exceptional mind, which indeed it would be an exceptional mind to hold all this kind of information. But we also have people who would say, just because the father says, or just because he documented this, doesn't mean that he was not orchestrating this, or that any of these parents were orchestrating it. So I'd like to bring that up and have you speak to that, because I think it is a legitimate concern that in many cases parents may even mindlessly or not necessarily consciously be inserting things or forgetting that they're inserting things. In the case of facilitated communication and some of the conversations around the telepathy tapes, for example, parents, the whole point of making unconscious gestures or sounds is that you don't know you're making them. And if someone says, we can detect that you're making unconscious to you, you know, but perceptible indications. I mean, it's the horse counting, right? The whole point of unconscious things is that they're not conscious to the person experiencing them. Can you speak a little bit to what might be happening with people who say, like, the parents are just making this up? Like, how do you verify that they're not?
Well, first of all, I mean, James Houston, again, it's not like there have been things written about this guy. I mean, but beyond that, when they did this ABC News interview, if they were going to orchestrate this whole thing, that was their golden opportunity to say, we've discovered that he was remembering this one pilot's life. But they didn't have that information then. So they didn't say that. So they gave the details that James was giving, but they didn't know if it could be verified. And in fact, we've got email exchanges between James's dad and one of the producers saying, keep looking for this Jack Larson. That sounds like a good lead, and all these things that then ultimately proved to match for Houston's life, but at the time were unknowns. So the so-called stranger cases where no one in the kid's life knew about this person, those are the ones that are the most impressive.
Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by Beam.
Sleep is one of the most essential and most overlooked parts of our health. And it's not just the end of the day, it's the beginning of how you show up tomorrow. If you've been here any amount of time, you know that sleep has not always come easy for me. I go through stretches where, I could just lay awake for hours. My mind is racing. I keep checking the clock, knowing I'm going to pay for it the next day, and so will everyone else. I've tried meditation, exercising before bed, you name it, I have tried it. But I love Beam's Dream Powder, which is a healthy nighttime blend designed for people who take their sleep health seriously. With science-backed ingredients like reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin, Beam's Dream Powder is formulated to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and wake up sharp without the grogginess that so many other sleep aids can give you. Dream helps you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and wake up sharp. No grogginess, no junk, just clean, effective support for real recovery. I am not spending each night tossing and turning or hitting that snooze button 5 times. I am up and ready to go every day because of deep restorative sleep that I get after using Dream. And I'm not the only one. Beam has already improved over 17.5 million nights of sleep, helping people across the country wake up and feel their best. Plus, Dream tastes incredible, and it's part of my nightly routine. Right now, Beam's offering up to 40% off their best-selling Dream Powder for our listeners. Perfect timing to lock in your summer sleep strategy. Go to shopbeam.com/breakdown and use code BREAKDOWN at checkout. That's shopbeam.com/breakdown and use code breakdown for up to 40% off.
Grab the deal and give your sleep the same attention you give the rest of your health today. Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Spot and Tango.
When Archie first came into Jonathan and my life, he was dealing with some allergy issues like skin, eyes, lots of itching. That's what led us to switch to Spot and Tango's Unkibble, and it has been a complete upgrade. Archie eats it up like it's his favorite thing in the world, which we think it is. Spot and Tango's Unkibble is everything regular kibble isn't. It's made with real human-grade ingredients personalized to what your dog actually needs. It's dry food that you can feel good about, and it's pantry-friendly too. Archie can totally taste the difference with Spot and Tango's Unkibble. It's made with 100% whole, fresh ingredients, like real USDA meats, fruits, and veggies, but it's 40% less expensive than frozen food.
Their food is amazing, and also their treats. There is a chicken treat that Archie goes absolutely crazy for, and every night he tries to sleep in my bed, and I use these chicken treats to lure him out of my bed and put him into my son's room. It is actually one of the only things that when he is really tired, he will get up and move for.
Spot and Tango also helps create a custom plan based on your dog's age, weight, breed, and activity level, and they include a pre-measured scoop so you can get it right every time. Upgrade your pet's bowl with Spot and Tango Unkibble for a limited time. Go to spotandtango.com/break. Use code BREAK to get 50% off your first order. That's spotandtango.com/break, code BREAK to get 50% off your first order.
spotandtango.com/break, code BREAK.
I want you also to kind of speak a little bit to the framework of why we can study, for example, case studies, and your book from 2015 is in particular some very special studies or case studies. Jeffrey Kripal is a friend of the podcast and a friend of ours, and when I read his book, which kind of talks about thinking impossibly, it kind of presents from for lack of a better explanation, from the social science perspective and from the humanities perspective, the importance and the significance of valuing every single human's experience, even if it doesn't fit into a scientific paradigm, even if it doesn't fit into a materialistic paradigm. What I'm interested in with you in particular is you've had this incredible career exploring from a completely scientific perspective, meaning from a materialist framework. You've been able to explore things that in many cases defy even the most basic tenets of what is required to examine something scientifically. Meaning, when we think of the scientific method, when we think of the reproducibility and the efficacy of being able to recreate things in a laboratory setting and remove things from their natural environment to recreate them in order to provide what many people say is proof, right? If this person's telepathic, I want you to prove it 6 ways to Sunday in every laboratory, remove them from everything that's comfortable to them, and you have to prove it, and that's the only way that we know that it's true. But what Jeffrey Kripal introduces, and I think what your work is elaborating on in an even, for me, more meaningful way, is a case study, even if it's one, that has so many elements that are compelling and that require further investigation, deserves to be treated as legitimate and investigated as such. Can you speak to some of the challenges of working with individual cases and what we are able to say or what we can extrapolate based on even one case study, and why you believe that that's valid?
Well, first of all, this is not controlled laboratory science. And, when you're studying spontaneous events, you have to accept that there can be limitations. So we've not been trying to prove anything. What we've been exploring is there evidence? So with science, typically, proof is not even the goal. And Ian Stevenson, I'm sure he's quoting other people, but he said proof should only be used in mathematics, because it's about accumulating evidence enough where eventually it gets accepted. It's different from, and even controlled laboratory science, you're not proving anything. What you're showing is that it's beyond statistical significance, that there's something there. Now, as far as coming from a scientific point of view, I would challenge your idea that that means it has to be from a materialistic point of view. Again, when you're in the real world, not a perfectly controlled world, yes, there's some limitations that you have to accept. So you think, okay, well, one case doesn't prove much, doesn't provide much evidence. If the case is compelling enough, it does require an explanation. So with these cases, you add James Langer onto the other 2,200 cases we've investigated, and needless to say, they're not all as strong as his are. But if you look at the cases, this work as a group, then I think the evidence does become impressive. And I mean, we can do statistics looking at various aspects of it, but as far as coming down to, okay, is he reincarnated or not, as a whole, I think you can reasonably conclude, yeah, I think so. So because more preponderance of the evidence, perhaps instead of beyond the shadow of a doubt, but I think good case can be made that preponderance of the evidence would lead you to conclude that some young children do have memories of a life in the past.
To me, this is the closest that many of us have come to, having an actual understanding of consciousness existing outside of, right, the current consciousness that we have perception of. What would it even mean to say that there is life after death?
Well, what I think it means is that there is a consciousness realm that interacts with the physical reality, but is also apart from it. So that when a person's physical body dies, the consciousness aspect might live on in a different way. Not to get into it too much, but I think a strong case can be made and has been made that reality, that consciousness is what is fundamental, and that physical matter is actually derived from consciousness. But that ultimately reality at its core grows out of consciousness.
This is an enormous statement. So the notion is, I'm just like, I want you to walk us through it. The notion is that we have a consciousness and we identify as the person that's in this physical body. The only kind of way to understand these cases would be to say that there is some way that certain individuals, young children, are accessing someone else's consciousness from a different time?
On the face of it, the simplest explanation is that someone remembers a past life because they lived the past life. But yes, there are certainly other possibilities to consider, even if you accept the cases. And, if there is this realm of consciousness, I mean, it's almost certainly not linear. And so, I mean, we try to put everything in sort of a framework we can understand, but I suspect it's beyond our understanding. You could look at the idea, okay, rather than this individual continuing on and then having a new life, like you're saying, is it that somehow the information continued but wasn't alive, so to speak? So it didn't survive, but it kind of continued and then got picked up somehow by a young child. It's worth exploring the idea at least. And then there are also the idea of so-called Akashic Records.
Okay, you just pulled it out of my head because I was like, this exists, right? For thousands of years, people have talked about this. And there are many people who believe that they can dip into other realms of consciousness. And for the most part, they are ridiculed, dismissed. They have communities where they, congregate together. But this is not something that we talk about, right? And here we are talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I bring it up as one example of things to consider. But yeah, the idea of the Akashic Records is that there's this infinite database of everything that's ever happened and everyone that's ever lived and so forth, and that people can, pull up a file or a file opens up and then people can incorporate it. and then either know about the past or believe they lived in the past. Now, again, that concept, I'm not here to promote it by any means, but the idea that this realm of consciousness would include, again, material that's not necessarily surviving, but simply exists, is something worth thinking.
This is not one kid in the middle of Louisiana in recent decades. For a tremendous amount of recorded history, this has been something that has been talked about, but you in particular are sort of privy to over 2,000 cases. And there's a sort of systematic process by which you kind of tackle these, right? And try and see, is there something here? One of the things that keeps coming up, and I can't get my head around this. What is up with the birthmarks and the birth defects?
So Ian Stevenson was, before he got into all this and had quite a successful mainstream career, much of it was in psychosomatic medicine. So the interface between mind and body. So with these cases, he got really intrigued by them. And it's where the kids, not only did they talk about past life memories, but they were born with birthmarks or even full birth defects that match wounds, usually the fatal wounds, on the body of the previous person. And I mean, I confess when I first got into this work, that seemed almost like a bridge too far for me. I mean, how would a wound on a body then show up, and affect someone even if they were reincarnated? What I have come to conceptualized, and what Ian conceptualized, was that it's not so much the literal physical wound on the body, but more of how that affects the consciousness. So, for instance, if you're getting your fingers chopped off as you're being murdered, that affects the consciousness, and then in the case I'm talking about, then leads to similar impact on the developing fetus and leads to deformed fingers when the child is born. There is good evidence that at times mental images can produce very specific effects on the body. I mean, we all know that stuff in the mind can have general effects on the body. So, when you're nervous and your heart starts beating fast, I mean, there's obviously a connection there, but at times it can be very specific. And the idea would be, if you've got someone who is sensitive enough that they carry that trauma with them or that image with them onto a developing fetus, which then makes it develop something similar. So, there's sort of a logic to it. And certainly, I mean, Ian approached those cases with the same careful approach that he used with the other cases, where when he learned about a case, he tried to first of all, get an autopsy report of the previous person. And in the Asian cases, those were often not available, but then talking to as many witnesses as he could who saw the body to determine, does this kid's birthmark or birth defect actually match what the previous person was?
This part of the story would negate the idea that they're simply remembering or they're accessing an experience that wasn't their own. This would indicate that they actually did live through it.
I mean, it certainly gets harder to explain how a download of information would then produce a birth defect. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't twist it and make it, squeeze it in there, but yes, I mean, that becomes less persuasive.
Although, just to steelman that argument, if they did download it and they experienced it that viscerally, and they, read it and they have an active imagination, I'm just playing with what the consciousness could be doing, then potentially it forms, but it's a harder case to make.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, you have to think, okay, if in the future someone was able to take all of your memories and implant them in my mind, did I experience them? Or is it just that it feels like I experienced them? I mean, I don't know. So yes, I agree with exactly what you said. It becomes less plausible if you accept these birthmark cases. but it's not to say it's impossible.
Is anyone net new here, or are we all just recycled consciousness? Because there are more and more people. So you would think that wherever consciousness comes from, there has to be people who have not had all these previous lives in order to justify all the population of the earth.
Yes, many people have asked about that. So years ago now, a professor at Johns Hopkins did the statistics on it. And in fact, so if you look at how many people have lived in the past, you have to make some estimates, obviously. There have been far more people who have lived in the past than are alive in the present. Now, the interval between lives would have to be growing smaller for us all to squeeze in. But some people have thought that population growth makes reincarnation impossible, and that's simply not true. On the other hand, I actually agree with you that who's to say there aren't new souls coming into existence? I mean, it may be that they are sort of eternal and separate from space-time and, have always been here and always will be. But we don't know that. And it may be new ones bubbling up all the time.
Or they come from some other system, enter our database. There may be multiple Akashic records. The Akashic records that are spoken about in our religious lineage may just be the library on the block. And there could be other blocks with other libraries, and there could be book exchanges. We don't know.
Yes, I mean, I actually think that, if this is a reality that grew out of consciousness, why would there not be other realities that have grown out of consciousness? So it may be, I actually personally, this is just a belief, but my personal belief is that reincarnation, if it occurs, it doesn't occur necessarily to everyone. That while I think there is reasonable evidence to say that a part of us can survive death, we may then have completely other experiences that in other universes or other realities, and not all come back here.
I think you estimated at about 70% of these cases, the people that they are channeling, embodying, remembering, died from an unnatural cause, and in many cases, a traumatic one. And this is something that that we talk about a lot, and it did come up in our conversation about the telepathy tapes, which is not to say that nonverbal autistic children have trauma, but once you're dealing with a system that is operating differently, either because of, let's say, being a nonverbal autistic child, or having a traumatic experience, a near-death experience, it's possible that, and we talked about this with Scott Barry Kaufman, it is possible to imagine that there is some sort of differential susceptibility to really being in touch with certain parts of ourselves and possibly other realms. So, when I was in grad school for neuroscience, there was discussion at that time of, can we find God in the brain? What does the brain look like of someone who is more likely to believe in God? Like, what is the thing that makes people want to believe, right? And this is a conversation we can have, in a religious framework, but we can also have it in this kind of framework to say, if everyone's brain is different, by and large, we're the same, but everybody's a little bit different. Is it possible that a situation where death involved some sort of trauma is more easily accessible to those who have extra perceptual capabilities? So I've worked with many, many energy healers who can pick up on things indeed that seem to be from another realm, or they will know simply by looking at me from across the room where there is dis-ease in my body, right? This is something that energy workers tap into. They're trained to read different aspects of a person. Can you talk a little bit about this link between traumatic death and then also kind of a heightened perceptive ability that might be able to access that easier?
Yes, you're right. 70% die by unnatural means: murder, suicide, combat, accident, things like that, which is way more than you would expect in the general population. And even the ones who die natural death, they tend to be young. So a quarter of them are under the age of 15. So it seems that sort of a life ending too early either increases the chances that a child will later talk about that life.
Wow.
And it may be that those kinds of factors lead the consciousness to sort of stay near this realm and then come back. So I mean, there are exceptions to everything. There are the natural deaths, but there may be particular factors that either lead intact memories to come through or lead the individual to come back to this life, this world at all. Our group is starting to try to look to ways to explore some of what you were mentioning. So we are going to look into certain testing. So, for instance, people with PTSD, there are some tests where they show particular patterns or tendencies. Well, is this phenomenon like PTSD? Is it a post-traumatic kind of thing? So the plan is to then do the same kind of testing with some of these people and see if they show the same tendencies as people with PTSD. Another kind of thing to look at, there are people who have incredible personal memories. So, you may have heard about it, but you can say, what were you doing on March 4th, 1971? And they can tell you. So those people, if you look at testing how they perform, could you get similar results with these kids showing, okay, so maybe it's not a traumatic thing, but maybe it's just exceptional memory that even carries over into past life. So just trying to sort it all out.
Like my memory is so good. I can't only tell you what I had for breakfast or what I did last year, but I can remember the consciousness that I can access from 7 generations ago. I got a really good memory.
Right. A really good memory. Now, I will say most of these kids do not show other sort of psychic abilities, with occasional exceptions, but for the most part, they don't seem to be especially gifted in that way. So it's not necessarily that they have a channel, open channel to the other information more than other kids.
So along those lines, what happens to these kids when they get older? Like you talk about that many of these things kind of, I don't want to say fizzle out, but when they're, older, that it sort of goes away-ish. What do we think might be happening there? And do some of them carry this throughout their lives?
Right. So most of the kids stop talking about these things at around school age, 6 or so, 5 to 7, something like that.
They have so much homework to do. They can't spend their time thinking about their past lives.
Well, yeah, I think that actually is sort of part of it, that they get wrapped up in this life. But in addition, that's the same age where we all lose our early childhood memories. Early childhood amnesia, where as you know better than I, the brain has undergone tremendous changes around then, and you get this pruning effect. And so in any event, memories for all of us has, occasionally you get little glimmers from long before then, but for the most part, they all fade out. So it would make sense that these would fade as well. And then they kind of just go on and lead their lives. So we've recently done a study where we interviewed adults who we originally studied when they were kids.
Wow.
And when we talked with these people and gave them some things to fill out, questionnaires to fill out and so forth, basically they are doing just fine. And educational wise, actually a majority of them had at least a college degree, and some had advanced degrees. And occupationally, it runs the gamut. I mean, one is an air traffic controller. There are people in healthcare. So they basically seem like everyone else, maybe actually doing a little better overall. Some maybe depression and anxiety, but not necessarily more than you would expect in the general population. Well, first of all, some of them do still have at least vague memories from the past. In fact, almost half of them did. Nothing clear, none of them reported clear memories like they expressed when they were younger, but at least some. a number of them commented on how it had given them a more spiritual outlook in life. Some of them, even though they didn't remember, they didn't still have the memories, they didn't even remember talking about the memories, but just being told what they had said opened them up more, where they had kind of a spiritual outlook. So I think in the long run, for many of them, it was a positive experience, even though while it's happening, often it's difficult for the children and for the parents.
What children displayed psychic ability, and what kind of psychic ability did they display?
Well, there's one case where the little boy, his mom and I were exchanging emails back and forth, and so we got documented things like he told his grandmother that she was going to get chicken pox, and then a couple of weeks later she broke out in shingles. So they're not necessarily saying, "Oh, in your past life you did this." I mean, they're not like a professional psychic, but there are times where within their own lives they seem to have access to some stuff.
Have you ever had experiences with adults who did not show this memory as children, who were able to, either through hypnosis or some other mechanism, have that recollection at an older age?
We're actually quite skeptical about past life hypnotic regression, because hypnosis is an unreliable tool even for memories in this life, which is why they're not allowed in courtroom testimony. At times it can be amazing, and people can remember license plate numbers from crime scenes or whatever. But a lot of times the mind just fills in the blanks, and then it's very hard for someone to distinguish a memory or did my mind just make it up. So with occasional exception or a few exceptions, I think there's little. Most hypnotic regression cases do not provide evidence of a link to the past life. Now, the larger question of adults. So we study kids mainly for two reasons. The main one being is that's where we're hearing the cases. They seem to be the ones most likely to report memories of a past life. But also with adults, I mean, adults can be exposed to all kinds of information. In fact, there have been cases with hypnosis where they then re-hypnotize the person, ask them where they had learned that, and they said in a book they had read 10 years before and completely forgotten about. So we all get exposed to a lot. So you'd be pretty comfortable that a 2-year-old was not exposed to the life of one particular pilot who was killed back in 1942. But for adults, it gets really tricky. So sometimes people can, not necessarily that they know about one particular deceased individual, but they can give you information from a past culture that seems mind-boggling, but you can't say for sure whether they hadn't learned it.
Is there any reason that children who are remembering past lives, in theory, should only remember past lives from the country that they live in?
Well, there are exceptions to that, but you're right. Most of the kids do remember a life from the same country, and sometimes from quite close by. And also, they tend to remember recent lives. I mean, James Langer is actually an exception because his was 50 years. But a lot of times, it's the average is 4.5 years.
Wait. Hold on. Wait. What?
They are describing very recent lives. Now, if it's really recent, it's easier to verify than one that's from 100 years ago. So, I mean, there may be some sampling issues.
But the plane of consciousness does not have, in my mind, it's kind of like the God I believe in, the plane of consciousness that I would understand does not have a preference for language or location necessarily, right? I mean, unless we're talking about some sort of, again, this would be outside of our current perceptual understanding or analysis of time and space, but that there is some sort of closeness, right? That in some way is more or less accessible. But in theory, I mean, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, when people do past life regressions, you can find yourself anywhere around the world, but you're always going to speak in the language that is, in theory, your native tongue. I'm sorry, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what it would look like for 4.5 years So you mean like someone dies and then right away they're in somebody else's body?
There are cases like that, literally. For intact memories to come through to a new life, it has to be one that is, or almost always has to be one that is close in some sort of way, is either close in time or close in distance or close in identification. I identify as American. So there are patterns or ties or something that have the person come back to a kind of a similar life to what they went through before.
Well, I just want to though continue this kind of line of thinking, because if there don't have to be rules about it, right? Which there can be observations and there can be tendencies, but there don't have to be rules about it. So as you talked about with Scott Barry Kaufman, if there is something encoded in some way, whether that is something, it could be epigenetic, but let's just say that there is something encoded that in theory makes some more able to access things than others, right? And that's a very vague collection of genetic information I'm sort of saying is passed on. There's no reason that that couldn't allow access to something within one's lineage, especially if we're talking about any sort of genetic or epigenetic transmission.
Right. So are you suggesting it might be that the memories come through that way? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying either the memories or the ability to access other aspects of consciousness, that if we're talking about there being a spatial or temporal or spatiotemporal, relationship of this, I don't have a problem saying that for certain people, this may occur in their direct lineage because there is something in their direct genetic or epigenetic information that is allowing them to have access to that in special ways, which doesn't have to be true of every child you look at, because we are talking to you and you're this amazing person who gets to entertain these things.
Well, right. So, yes, I mean, there may be a genetic propensity to be able to remember past lives. And you're right, there is the question of epigenetic transmission of trauma. You probably know it better than I do, but there's this study with mice where they associated a shock with, I think, a sound or smell or something. And then not only did their offspring get anxious with the smell, but even their offspring did.
I can tell you it's true from those of us who have grandparents who fled Eastern Europe. And, there's all these incredible studies about, my 23 chromosomes, right, that my mother gave me were in my grandmother when she was fleeing. And there's all sorts of, interesting stuff there. But I think that plays into what you've reported, in terms of trauma too.
But the other thing I'll point out is some people have wondered are these seeming past life memories, is it genetic memory? And the short answer is no, because first of all, to inherit the genes that have the memory, you'd have to be a direct descendant. And in most of these cases, that's not true. And the other is, as we talked about, 70% of the kids have memories of dying in the past life, which of course would have been after the person passed on their genes.
If you were to take off your Dr. Tucker hat just for a second, and you and I are having a cup of tea, and we're just hanging out and we're just talking, can you, in the plainest terms, explain to me, with your understanding of the world and of science, what is actually happening here?
I have become quite convinced that there's more than just the physical world, that there is this element or realm of consciousness, first of all, and that we all have a piece of it. What it looks like to me is that there are times when the consciousness comes back to this same reality in a young child. And again, there may be various factors that cause that to happen. I'm not saying that's what typically happens. That may not be the sort of the normal process, but in these cases, it seems to have happened. And that doesn't give us all the answers, but it does, I think, let us consider, again, that the materialist view is simply incomplete, and that there is this piece that is overlooked, that this consciousness piece. And, when I was saying consciousness is fundamental in matter, is derived from it. That's actually a quote from Max Planck, who is the father of quantum theory. So, we're in pretty good company of considering the idea that not only is there more than we're aware of, but that actually at the core, this all comes out of this consciousness.
Well, I mean, Planck and all of those guys would even go so far as Thomas Campbell goes, as to say that consciousness has a source, and that source is all of the things that, in theory, we use the human word love to describe. Right? Coherence, which is something we can measure physiologically, right? Physiological coherence, homeostasis, feeling connected, feeling loved, feeling held. Those are exactly the words that religion and mystics for thousands of years have tried to convince people to tap into in order to have more cohesion in their life. So I wonder, can you speak a little bit to what does this mean if we extend this notion of consciousness to there being an even larger consciousness that is creating our reality as we know it? For some people, they call that God. I'm not so hung up on terminology.
Yeah, and it does get complicated how much agency we have, versus God or again, whatever term you use, creating it. I happen to believe that we do have agency and that we're all creating it. But anyway, they talk about agent-dependent realities, that each observer, or they use the term agent because we have more agency than just observing, but that each agent has their own reality, and it's they all get put together, and it looks like this one reality that we have. But actually, they're all these kind of separate pieces that go together. But that we're all on this journey together is what I would say. That whether there's one sort of large mind or consciousness, it shows that the universe and the reality, it doesn't have to be meaningless. That there is meaning. We're not just a random collection of molecules, and it's pointless and meaningless and nothing. But I think, certainly not how I like to view it. I think that we can find meaning in our lives and create meaning in our lives as part of this larger picture that we only get glimpses of.
When we had Thomas Campbell on, he described his introduction. He was a young grad student. He was studying physics, and he was introduced to transcendental meditation, which we know a lot about. It's actually one of the forms of meditation that we know the most about, I think, from a kind of scientific and physiological perspective. And the very first time that he tried transcendental meditation, he was shot off into another plane of consciousness. He was not on drugs. He does not believe in drugs. He experienced a reality that was not this reality. And what he described started happening, and it happened in one very specific day. He started seeing what looked like cotton candy on all of the trees. And it was connecting between everything. And he said that he said to someone, "What is happening with these trees?" And the person said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And what he came to understand was that by tapping into this other realm of consciousness, some of us are able with ease to see, for lack of a better word, the energetic properties of everything that exists, not just living things. He could see electrical equipment that had charge coming off of it, right? And I wonder, can you speak a little bit, because this gets into a realm that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, of saying we are energetic bodies, that there is an understanding of us as energetic beings, that once you dip into other forms of consciousness and other understandings of our human experience, it can transform the way that we literally see the world and the way that we behave in it and the way that we function. And this is something Jonathan and I are so interested in. What if this, for many people, is that missing piece? I mean, you're a psychiatrist, a lot of things ail us We have epidemics of anxiety, of depression, of trauma, of overdiagnosis, of underdiagnosis, ADHD, all these things. And for many people, in particular people who have been at the depths of despair, many people say that the thing that allowed them to climb out of that hole was an understanding that there is something bigger than us, right? And for many people, that's finding sobriety through a higher power. For many people, it's a religious experience. But we're talking about a scientific experience, right? A scientifically calculable experience of understanding consciousness as proving this kind of connection. Can you speak a little bit to all of this in terms of these worlds that you're bridging? Because many people find this very, very disturbing and they just want to push it away.
Right. Some people have spontaneous mystical experiences, separate from TM or drugs or anything else. And it typically involves a sense of kind of all is one, that, everything is connected. There was a study of cancer patients who were experiencing death anxiety, where they were given one dose of psilocybin, which is a psychedelic and magic mushrooms, quote unquote, and it erased their death anxiety. These things are significant, and it doesn't mean we should all go out and do psilocybin, but if we can, in our own way, on our own path, try to connect more with this sort of the underlying reality of connection and, like you say, love and meaning, then I think it can enrich our lives and also hopefully help us treat each other a little better.
Another point about our conversation with Thomas Campbell that relates to the fact that 70% report dying in a traumatic way. His idea, and I feel similarly, is that the consciousness system has a objective for its own existence, and that we're moving towards a sense of homeostasis or love or repair in some fashion. So it's interesting to think about those that died in a traumatic way are more likely to remember it. Maybe there is a healing, a processing that needs to happen in the new life, and therefore they're more apt to remember a traumatic death.
We each come to this life with kind of different things to work on, or different aims for a lifetime. I mean, again, if you accept the premise of all this, and yeah, if people have been through bad trauma, which is not to say that you try to uncover past life trauma, but I mean, it may play out in relationships or with fears or whatever. And that may be part of sort of the normal process that, again, we all come here with various issues, to be sure. And, the task is sort of the journey to work through some of that.
As you've become more non-material in your approach to this life, have you dabbled in any sort of exploration for yourself, and not necessarily psychedelics, but just in terms of your own consciousness practice or connecting with intuitive abilities, anything like that?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, for a while, I meditated on a pretty regular basis, more like mindfulness kind of meditation, but I confess that's been years. But I think I have reached a sense of there's meaning in looking outside as I'm doing right now and seeing the leaves and the grass, and there's meaning in giving my dog his dinner, which makes him happy, and obviously in the connections that we have with each other. So I've actually come to a point where the question of do we reincarnate, and really even do we survive, has become sort of less important to me, because what is important is this life and the experiences and interactions that we have with people now, and kind of being at peace with that regardless of what comes later.
That's beautiful. What would you say to a parent who may be experiencing a child that has unusual memory or is communicating to them and about things that they don't understand? What advice would you give to them?
I mean, a couple of things. One, it's good to be open, obviously, to what their child is saying, And especially if the child is really emotional about it, to let them have voice, but not to become overly focused on potential past life and start asking the child a bunch of questions, and partly because it may be upsetting to the child. But then from our standpoint, you start asking, pumping them with questions, they start making up answers, and then it's harder to kind of investigate the case. But it does seem to help the children for people to acknowledge that they have those memories, and they may well have experienced those things, but that's in the past, and now you're here with us, safe in this life. So you don't discount them, but you also put the memories in perspective that now you're with us. And then we tell parents, even though that can be extremely upsetting at the time, in a few years, this stuff is going to fade, and the kids end up developing fine.
An adjacent sort of, I don't know, experience or exploration. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to near-death experiences. Obviously, it's different, and also it kind of falls into this similar-ish realm. Can you speak a little bit about, if your division, if the division of perceptual studies also explores things like near-death experiences, and sort of what is your sort of take on what's happening in these experiences?
Yes, we do. And in fact, Bruce Grayson, a colleague of mine, has published far more papers on near-death experiences than anyone else in the world. What a near-death, for people who don't know, near-death experiences are typically when people come very close to physical death, or even where their hearts stop. Instead of their mind shutting down as their brain is shutting down, they actually experience sharpened thinking. And many of them will describe kind of floating above their body. They may watch what's happening, and some of them will then report details of the code that's taking place, the CPR and all that. Some of them will encounter deceased loved ones. Occasionally, there are cases where they encountered deceased loved ones and said, "What are you doing here?" Because they didn't know that, for instance, in one of the cases, know that the brother had died. And then often there is a sense of a bright light, or that everything is light, and some of them certainly interpret that as God, and they feel an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance, while at the same time many of them have life reviews where they see where they failed, but that they get the message, basically that it's all okay, that it's all for a reason. And then many of them come to a point of no return, where they are either given the choice or they're told, you have to go back, it's not your time. And then they will wake up in their bodies, which is often coming back to a lot of pain. And these are life transforming for these people. And there's a lot there. And in fact, we actually did one study looking at kids' reports of the interval between lives versus near-death experience reports, and there are certainly similarities. Some of the kids would talk about when they died, essentially describing a near-death experience, floating above their body, meeting spiritual guides or whatever. And then there's this kind of spiritual component to the whole thing that's present in both. I mean, they've been reported since antiquity, but they're reported a lot more because a lot more people are brought back from being very near death.
What have we learned from neuroimaging of psychic phenomenon, people who are in that, receptive state? Has there been sort of significant insight using neuroimaging?
Well, that's also something that we have a neuroimaging lab that we've been doing some of that work. And a lot of it is still to be continued. But there have been studies of testing nuns or Buddhist priests, deep meditators, and seeing that, for instance, some parts of the brain kind of go quiet, and ones that place you in physical place tend to go quiet, and where people seem to have a kind of a mystical kind of experience of connecting with something.
Dr. Tucker, it's been so fascinating to get to talk to you, and we really appreciate it and appreciate your work. and everything that you've contributed to this field, which, you know, spills over into so many. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It's been fun talking.
I really enjoyed speaking to Dr. Tucker, but here's the thing. I wish he wasn't a psychiatrist. Why? If he wasn't a psychiatrist, he could be like, oh my gosh, you guys, people die, but then they come back in other bodies. And like kids have these experiences and it's cray. But I've been to many psychiatrists in my life. They all have that vibe, meaning they're chill. They don't have huge reactions. Like, I'm freaking out about what he's saying because I think that this is unbelievable that even based on these individual case studies, that this person is completely comfortable saying, oh yeah, there's some other plane that we don't know, we don't understand. And apparently some people can experience that in different lifetimes. What? That's amazing.
He's very understated.
That's what I mean.
He's presenting like the largest, most shocking pieces of information, but doing it in a way not to cause alarm. Like, I don't want to stir the pot here, but by the way, kids are having memories that we cannot explain whatsoever.
It's happening. It's totally happening.
But it's true what he said in terms of it isn't about all those past lives, and people can get lost. You know, I'm glad he said he's skeptical of hypnosis, and there's a lot of time and I think energy spent on people going backwards. And maybe that provides some information that comes forward and helps them in the present moment, but simply exploring past life for the sake of past life, I've always been quite skeptical about.
I mean, look, I've had an experience with someone who was, I would say, very skilled in understanding lots of different realms in ways that I cannot. And you know, the past life regression process is one of, you know, kind of what I think Carl Jung would have described as sort of, it is a creative imagination exercise. It's really dropping out of that logical part of your brain that says, this didn't happen, I'm imagining it. It's like all that stuff goes away. And if you've ever had a psychedelic experience, that's the part of your brain that gets turned off. So in case you're wondering like why you can have access to things, I mean, there's lots of chemical reasons, which I'm happy to go into in a different episode. But the reason that you can experience things and it feels so real is that the part of your brain that tells you no is offline. So when you're doing a past life regression, if you are able to kind of get into that zone, in theory, we might say you're able to access things. I think the same is true of Akashic Records and people who are going in there. If you can drop into that place, right? It's described as kind of getting out of your head and into your heart, into your body. And that's what any good practitioner does. Even regular doctors are doing, right? They're trying to understand their patient. That's in theory something that some people might be able to tap into, but I don't think it should be sort of used lightly, as it were.
It should not be used lightly. There's a book called How to Read the Akashic Records. It's a how-to, and I would say the prerequisites for that type of book, if it is a self-taught versus going to a class, but even if it's going to a class, the prerequisites are that probably there's some form of mindfulness experience, some form of altered states of consciousness, again, not talking about psychedelics, but moving out of your thinking brain into a creative imagination in visual experience, having done some personal, either not necessarily hypnosis, but parts work, or where you've done creative visualization and gone on internal journeys. That book came into my life, and I met a woman who really described a lot of these phenomenon to me. And, you know, I haven't talked really about this, but I spent some time practicing, working on this, training with this woman, and I would do some Akashic readings for people. And sometimes those readings would talk about past lives, and people were very, very curious about past lives. As Thomas Campbell explains, we get the data, but we interpret the data based on our own experience. So I was always very cautious or hesitant to interpret the data in a biased way based on my experience, because obviously I can't, you know, my experience is what it is. It has a limitation to it. It was really just like setting a parameter of a search in a database. You have to, it's a meditative process, clearing one's mind, and then set the query for what you're searching for on behalf of either yourself or someone else, and then wait for the information to come.
This is outside of the realms of our understanding. What you're talking about, and I believe it's called the astral plane. You're talking about the astral plane, which is not the physical plane. This is the physical plane, right? Or, this is the information that my brain is receiving about this being the physical plane.
Only because it's practiced that.
So I'm just saying, for me, I've had, a few experiences in deep, meditative practice, meaning as practicing meditation. Something happens where my body feels like it's not functioning as a body the way it normally does. And this has only happened to me in very brief moments. Like, it'll drop in for a second and I'll have some awareness of, like, the best way I can describe it. It's like a quieting, not just a quieting of my thoughts. It's like a quieting of my physical being. And I think that when I've, heard people who practice meditation regularly, and I don't mean, with all due respect, people who are like, listening to a walking meditation or like meditating while you're in the car.
No, there's a difference between mindfulness, quieting, observing, and then accessing other planes of consciousness.
I'm talking about people who like are doing, like hours and hours of like Buddhist meditation as their training, or people like Thomas Campbell who are like shot off into another stratosphere, in TM from a mantra. Like, I'm talking about like a practiced situation. But for me, like, I've experienced that literally as soon as I have consciousness of it, it's gone. Like, you have to be able to live in that space, which I believe people like you have either practiced or have a genetic, set of genetic information that allows them to tap into that. And I do believe that of every legitimate healer that is out there. And a lot of people are healers who are using different practices and different methods, and that's fine. I'm not saying you're illegitimate, but what I'm talking about is not just like a person that like I see took out an ad in the back of a newspaper and I don't know who they are. But when I learn about people who are healers and I learn what they've practiced, what they've studied, what they've cultivated for themselves and their own spiritual practice, those people, I do believe, are able to get to this place that I've only gotten to literally for less than a second. I believe that something can happen there that I don't understand or have access to. And I don't know that I need to, because there's people like you who can do it.
What we're talking about is someone has to go somewhere and they're in with their consciousness and access another plane. Now, people get pulled out of that, right? It's like you can go there, and then when you talk about you've been there for a second and then you get pulled out, there are a handful of reasons why someone gets pulled out. Fear, analytical mind, being comfortable in an unknown, being comfortable not having information and sort of in that real gray space and not immediately switching back to the analytical mind, which is what we're most comfortable with. And two, finding ways when we begin to switch back into the analytical mind to reground ourselves and practice staying in this open, receptive, non-rational world. Again, and we talk about this in Thomas Campbell, is receiving the information is one thing, and then analyzing the data to say, how is it valuable? So it's one thing. I almost see it like you go into the records and like you're going to collect information. You're like pulling a book off a shelf, you're opening it, you're like, what does this page say? Is it relevant? And then there's a secondary process of how do I make sense of the things that I collect? So maybe you open the book, you see, you hear, or you feel something, you collect it, you put it on a examining table, you go take another piece of information, put it, and then a picture starts to form. So my experience is that depending on what type of physical state you're in, what type of emotional state you're in, how much caffeine has someone had, if there's alcohol involved, if there is a physical struggle happening, toxins or illness in the body, it's harder for the consciousness to act in, because it's like a different vibrational state when you're in that form of consciousness. I'm kind of really curious about the neuroimaging that's happening, because I think there's going to be a lot revealed of what it means physiologically to be in those mental states. What does it mean to act, not just be in a meditative state, but be in a receptive state where you're accessing maybe the Akashic Records or other planes of existence? And then what does that do physiologically? Does our heart rate slow down? Can we measure that? When you talk about not being able to stay there, I think it's practice. I do. I think it's practice and being okay and having not just the experience of doing it, but the system by which you can help yourself stay there when you get pulled out.
It's very challenging to entertain all of these things, especially knowing that a lot of, for example, Dr. Tucker's, research is literally cataloging to try and find what is consistent enough to rely on, in this realm. I really liked him talking about, evidence. Like, this is all, and Jeffrey Kripal would say that as well. This is all evidence. You don't get to say that evidence doesn't exist. You are allowed to say, I don't want to take that evidence and have it prove X, Y, or Z. But I think Dr. Tucker, this is exactly what his work at the University of Virginia is doing. They're trying to say, we will not discount evidence. Evidence is important. It has information. What can it tell us about a larger system, even if it's not proving anything?
And I think that's really important, where we're not trying to prove anything. When I did that work, I wasn't trying to prove anything. And in fact, I was very skeptical in any information that I would receive, because I didn't want to make assumptions. And there's a lot of people who are claiming to do this, that, as Thomas Campbell describes, there are 3 ways that you can access information. It can be you're accessing your own consciousness, you can access the consciousness of another person, or you can access the larger consciousness system. And so anytime anyone is engaged in this work, they don't 100% know where the information is coming from. So I think it's important to, do all of this. If people are interested in this type of work for themselves or working with someone else, be skeptical and take everything with a grain of salt to say, what can this actually provide me? Is it actual truth that I lived in this lifetime, or is it a metaphor? Are there themes that I'm bringing back into this world? And how do we stay as present as possible?
And I really loved, just to kind of put a button on this, I really, really loved his notion that, understanding all of these things potentially puts us more in touch with the best that we can offer, in our waking life. And I really love that emphasis as well. From our breakdown to the one we hope you never have. We'll see you next time.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you. She's got a neuroscience PhD or 2, and now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown.